And if we can't walk in love, we're a noisy little gong, a bitter little song that a bully sings out of key. And if we can't walk in peace, we'll forget about the least of these. A mother crying on her knees for a boy who's locked away. There's a voice calling me.
Okay, so it's Tuesday. The events that we're going to be talking about are about 4 days in the rearview mirror, and I think I needed that at this point to even be able to have a discussion about this. I mean, I busted out a coloring book last night. Amanda got me this Walking Dead adult coloring book for Christmas, which there's very few things I've changed my mind on as quickly as adult coloring. I thought it sounded like the dumbest and kind of catchiest, trendiest, most baseless thing in the world. And then I tried it and I'm like, oh, yeah, this goes well with like bourbon and a Wilco record. And it actually really does detox my brain and untangle it. So, I had to have a drink and color last night to even get my bearings to be able to do this this particular show. No guest. I'm just going to talk about 10 responses that I've seen to the events that went down in Charlottesville. I don't think at this point you need any kind of introduction to it. Just going to say that we're going to talk about the initial rally, the counter protests, and then the murder and the maiming of a person who died, and then 19 more. That was the thing I really actually wish I had not done. Is I wish I hadn't seen that car crash into a group of people and then back up and hit more people on the way back. If I had to do over again, I wish I could erase that out of my memory, right? So this is 10 questions and responses to the Charlottesville events. The first one is the alt-right and the right are the same thing. And this is just not helpful at all. One of the reasons this podcast exists is, of course, to find common ground, right? The reason this podcast exists is to find common ground in an increasingly divided America. And within, what I would say is acceptable to disagree on is a spectrum of people who really want the same thing. And that is that they want, the best for the average American or for the people or however you want to say it. And on the political left, that looks a lot more like fairness. That looks a lot more like the government trying to provide a level playing field. And on the political right, that looks a lot more like the rights of the individual being protected. And some combination of these things in any given situation is great, right? This is okay to disagree over because we need a mix of this to make America work. All right. The fringes, the alt-right, and then the Antifa, or alternately titled alt-left, these people do not exist within the traditional American experience. So the alt-right is basically this kind of underground of people that sometimes come to the surface, like Milo Yiannopoulos, who you can YouTube and find a lot of stuff that he said. And then a lot of white supremacists. And what these people are pushing is to where conservatism will be pushing, the rights of the individual, that it's really important for each person to have their rights protected. And when you get too society oriented, you do trample on the person, right? The alt-right is really about, first of all, they would say Western society. I would say white society. That they're like, well, we're defending Western values. No, you're defending white values. And so first of all, there's an implicit racism to the whole thing. Second of all, they are not small government. Like in a heck of a lot of things, I want a smaller government, a moderately smaller government. I don't want to blow it all up. But I would prefer to roll things back and do stuff in my view, I would rather just blow up the Department of Education at the national level, hand out the money, and see what happens. All that money we spend on a national level, just push it down to the states, And most of them are going to get better, I would wager to guess. And some of them are going to get dumber and worse and do a worse job. But the thing is, in a society with a free media, with a free press, the ones that are doing a worse job are going to get ratted out on, essentially. So therefore, they're more likely to come up. I think that's a way better solution than having a Department of Education that spends a lot of money basically to shove standardized tests down the throats of the students. All right. So that's where I would say I'm looking for a moderately smaller government. The alt-right is not looking for a smaller government. They're looking for a bigger government to do what they want to do. Okay. And that's very, very different. So, being a quote unquote ideologue or is kind of a negative way of saying somebody's an idealist. Here's what being an idealist looks like in this very difficult situation in Charlottesville, Virginia. The ACLU, which is traditionally thought of as a more liberal and even predominantly black organization, actually defended the rights of the KKK to protest around the Robert E. Lee statue that was, is scheduled to come down. By the way, one way to avoid this is as soon as, if you're going to pass a law that's, or, a local law that says that a statue is coming down, make sure that law says it's coming down within 48 hours. So there's not time for this crap. All right. So the ACLU, there are a lot of black people mad on Twitter about this, that they defended the right of assembly and free speech. I have so much respect for this because this is so difficult, but either you believe in free speech or you don't. And free speech has to apply to people you don't agree with. There's this movement on the left, or I'm going to say the alt-left right now, that, speech is violence. And if somebody says something that I don't like, then that's violence and I'm a victim. No, you're not a victim. People can say whatever they want. Unfortunately, some people are going to use that right to be white supremacists, and that's gross. However, the biggest threat to our society is not white supremacists, who are a vast minority and who can be defeated, who have been defeated before and can be defeated again. The biggest threat to our society is not having freedom of speech, because as soon as that happens, you wind up with a very, very bad situation. You wind up with what's going on in Russia right now. You wind up with Venezuela. These are not countries that had a free press, and things went way off the rails. So while white supremacy is terrible, I absolutely applaud the ACLU for standing up for them, because you either have free speech or you don't. You got to pick one. That's tough, right? I mean, it's really, really tough to stand up and say you believe this. You believe in free speech in a moment like this, but I still believe in free speech. What the alt-right wants is not, they don't want an ideology. They want the government to do what they want the government to do, which mainly involves pretty anti-minority policies, and basically they want a pro-white society as dictated by the government. You cannot have a pro-white society as dictated by the government and have classical conservatism, which is looking to protect the rights of all individuals. Okay, you can't have that. Those things are not the same thing. So all of a sudden we're getting into Nazis and communists, right? And really we're getting into Nazis and communists. And I've said that the international stage actually looks a lot like World War I right now, because one of the biggest sponsors in terrorism is Turkey. And we forget that the Ottomans, the Turks, were an empire from 1300 AD to, 100 years ago, right? And they controlled Greece and a heck of a lot of the Mediterranean. You think those people just forgot? They want their empire back. And so the global world may look like World War II, and this just sickens me. But our country is starting to have factions that look more and more. The global world looks like World War I. Our country's starting to have factions that look more and more like World War II. I'm not sure what my grandfather and great uncles answer the draft for if it wasn't to go kill those people. And I'm going to get into whether or not violence solves problems here coming up in just a minute. But to close out the alt-right thing, these people are not even on the political right, because the political right, at the heart of it, is protecting the rights of the individual. If you want a white society, you are in a form of socialism, in the way that both the Nazis and the communists were into a form of socialism. And we'll get to what the Antifa is here in just a second. But this has nothing to do with the traditional conservative platform in the United States. So you can stop with the, oh, well, if you voted for Trump or if you're a Republican, you had your hand on the wheels that car plowed into the crowd. That's not helpful for anybody. All right, what is the Antifa? The Antifa need a better name, first of all. They're anti-fascist. This is a group that is, unfortunately, pro-unprovoked violence, and they're Marxists. They're also people who live with their parents. No, really. 92% of arrests of adults in the Antifa, as one report found out, were of people whose residents were still with their parents. So these are kind of aimless, maybe a little bit rich, spoiled adults who like don't have a career and need something to do. The violent incidences in Berkeley, which ironically, one of those violent incidents was when Milo Yiannopoulos was speaking at Berkeley, or was scheduled to, and another one was when Ann Coulter was scheduled to speak there. These people have rioted because somebody's going to speak at a college, okay? And so this is where we have the Nazis and the communist thing. These are real communists, and they are willing to have preemptive violence and assaults be a part of their platform. And they're saying, well, we're fighting against the Nazis. And then the Nazis say, well, look at this. America's going communist. And I say that the greatest generation put bullets in the heads of both of your forebears. Let's go on. Number 3, in questions and responses to the events in Charlottesville. So what about the legacy of Robert E. Lee? This is difficult. So I'm going to unpack it point by point, and we'll try to arrive at some kind of conclusion. Okay. Robert E. Lee, you've got one side saying that that he was anti-slavery, and that he encouraged slave owners to let their slaves go and to be a part of the Confederate Army, and that they would win their freedom through fighting. And you've got the other side saying, yeah, he owned slaves. He wanted to send slaves back to Africa. So where is this man's legacy? First of all, regardless of what you think about this person, and regardless of the conclusion you draw, when we talk about people who are prominent in American history who own slaves, rather than making a blanket statement, the best thing to do is talk about what they were. Okay, and let the person who's listening to the conversation draw their own conclusion. So, for example, I can tell you that without a doubt, yes, Thomas Jefferson was both a slave owner and supposedly an abolitionist. And his whole thing was, okay, I got to get out of debt real quick, and I'm going to let all these slaves go. Problem was, the dude spent way too much money. Is that right to own another human being because, you have the 17th century version of credit card debt? Absolutely not. But do you want to judge Thomas Jefferson differently than, a slave owner in South Carolina that had come up from the Caribbean, from like Barbados or something, that virtually had to buy all new slaves every 5 years because they literally killed them. They worked them to death. They beat them to death, whatever. That's up to you, okay? But I think that we ought to at least talk about the particulars as opposed to making blanket statements, because making blanket statements is just bad history. So Robert E. Lee did inherit a few slaves from his mother, and he did marry into a slave-owning family. His wife and daughter did have they illegally did educate their slaves, and Robert E. Lee said that slavery was was immoral, it was wrong, and actually, even considered fighting for the Union. He really had a problem with attacking his home state of Virginia. So that's where, like, the pro-Robert E. Lee, we should leave the monument up, people come in. The anti-Robert E. Lee monument people would say, yeah, this dude owned slaves, and he was pretty brutal to his own slaves, whether or not, like, conceptually he said that that slavery was wrong. Like, look at what he did. And I would agree with that. You have to look at what somebody does with their lives, because if somebody's life is different in what they say and what they do, I mean, you can see which thing they really believe, right? It's what they do. Another critique of Lee was that that he and his wife actually started a fund to send freed slaves to Liberia. I have no idea what these slaves were going to do in Liberia, but this is a criticism of like, oh well, this guy, he wanted the blacks out of America. Man, I mean, this is tough, right? Because you have these two ideas throughout American history, and one of them is that we need to integrate and find community and live together, and I would agree with that. But for all this man's sins and for all the things you should judge him for, I'm not sure this is one of them. I think that there would have been way more economic prosperity and equality if right after the Civil War, we had actually set up like exodus states, right? So one of the things that I wish would have happened is I wish that, the Confederacy offered full statehood to the Indian tribes in Oklahoma if they would fight for the Confederacy. I have Cherokee roots. And my family's tribe fought for the Confederacy because they were promised revenge on, the army of Andrew Jackson, who had put him through the Trail of Tears 40 years earlier. Had that happened, had there been full Indian statehood, and had former slaves had a state to go to have their own democracy, which was fully protected apart from Jim Crow, and given the promise of 40 acres and a mule, I think that a lot of the stuff that would have been happening right now that's happened over the last 150 years wouldn't have happened. A lot of that has to do with the fact that that Johnson, Lincoln, the guy who succeeded Lincoln, was the worst president in American history. And people are like, no, well, Trump or Reagan or Bush or Obama. Yeah, okay. So what you're saying is American history has never existed until you were born, because you're that important. That the only possibility for the worst president ever was during your lifetime. Let me tell you something. Johnson hated both upper class free whites in the South, and he hated free blacks. He was prejudiced and he was classist, and he wanted to wreck both of those groups. So he intentionally screwed up destruction and harmed the Southern economy in a way that it's still not recovered today. Sorry, I had to blow my nose there. So back to Robert E. Lee. After the war, he wanted to move on. So Robert E. Lee wanted, to send slaves back to Liberia. I don't think that in and of itself is necessarily something that should go in the negative category, because if he thought that was a way to give these people a start over in life, that shouldn't be held against him. There's plenty to hold against him without that, right? But anyway, Lee did not want to be remembered as a hero. He didn't want this kind of whole lost cause narrative to happen. As far as he was concerned, the Confederacy was dead. It was never going to rise again, which contradicts a heck of a lot of T-shirts with the flag on it. And he just kind of wanted to fade into obscurity. He didn't want to be a hero. So it's ironic that the person that the white supremacists are rallying around didn't want this. The next thing is, are white supremacists more dangerous than Muslims? I don't know. I think that that anybody who has an ideology to kill people who are not like them is pretty dang dangerous. But let me point out something that is pretty troublesome in the media. There's this story going around of oh, well, there's more white supremacists that have committed acts of terror or hate crimes in the United States than Muslims from 2001 to now. Okay, a couple things. First of all, they're not counting September 11th. So what they did was they started this study in December of 2001, because once you start with 3,000 dead, it's pretty hard to ever for them, with the Muslims on 9/11, it's pretty hard for the white supremacists to ever pass that. And then they were counting acts, like acts of aggression or whatever, and not a body count. This is, I'm not arguing for one side or the other or trying to condemn all Muslims at this point. But this is just terrible journalism. It's completely dishonest to say, oh, well, white supremacists are clearly more dangerous than Islamic supremacists because, there's been more, attacks or whatever. Okay. If you're counting a hate crime, like spray painting a swastika on the car of a minority is a hate crime, and that's horrible. That's really not the same thing as shooting up a gay nightclub. Okay. And so when you just put the Pulse nightclub shooting together with 9/11, you're at 3,050 something, right? There's no way that the white supremacy has caused that kind of death in my lifetime. White supremacy definitely caused that kind of death in the Jim Crow era. There were over 3,000 lynchings, hangings, burning people alive, without a doubt. So, who's more dangerous, Islamic extremists or white supremacist extremists? It's not helpful, but neither is it helpful to talk about it in this way in the media. We're not getting any closer to any kind of solution. Number 5, this is Trump's fault. All right. Yeah, absolutely, without a doubt. Trump's response was horrible. And when he finally came back and condemned the KKK and the alt-right and white supremacists, it had basically been because his arm had been twisted. It's amazing when this guy forgets how to tweet. He can within 15 minutes tweet at people who challenged his, inauguration numbers. And yet he goes 2 or 3 days without saying KKK after the KKK carried out an attack, drove a car into a crowd full of people. That's reprehensible. Is it Trump's fault? I would say no. The KKK has existed long before Donald Trump came into the presidency, and he should be doing a lot more. But to blame him for something that has been around for a century and a half at this point has a very short-sighted view of history. Do I wish Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz was president right now? Oh my gosh, I've wished that every single day since Trump got elected. Those, were 2 candidates I absolutely loved. I would say the Trump, in my opinion, they are the 2 candidates that were the closest to my belief system that have come out of the Republican Party in my lifetime. And this idea in the media, they're like, oh, well, they're just already running for the 2020 election by condemning this stuff. Okay. You don't think that 2 Hispanic men might have a reason to condemn a white supremacist group other than running for president? That's the only way the Hispanic men might have an issue with a group that wants to kill all non-whites. It's the only thing you can think of. That's it. Only thing. Okay, number 6. The response is we should ignore it. This kind of goes back to whose fault is it? And I had somebody comment on this on Facebook. Oh, well, if we would just ignore this thing. Yeah, this is not going away. There are not planned protests in Boston and a couple other cities by the alt-right and white supremacists because of, the counter protests. There are planned protests because this movement is growing, and that has nothing to do with counter protests. All right. It has everything to do with the fact that there are angry white people out there that are Nazis. Okay. The Nazis didn't pop up the first time around in the U.S. or outside the U.S. Obviously the origin in Germany, they didn't pop up because somebody opposed them. They popped up because they were hateful, evil human pieces of garbage. And so to blame anybody that gets out there against them for their existence, I mean, that's like a time loop thing that's going on where it's this is a sci-fi movie of oh, well, maybe if they hadn't done this. Well, no, they didn't go back in time. Okay. This is not Looper, the movie with Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Bruce, oh man, it's early. Bruce, the guy from the 90s when it's all the Die Hards, Bruce Willis. There we go. This is not that. You cannot blame somebody for counter protesting for a movement to grow. The way somebody gets to a place of believing their race is superior does not happen because they see somebody else with a sign going against a racist. That's just really silly. Number 7, you're a bad guy if you suggest self-defense in a situation like this. This came in because I put up a video on the Neighbors Again podcast Facebook page where I showed a clip of the violence and said, hey, Violence in our world is real, and you'll probably never be in it, but you might want to get some training, because if you have some basic martial arts training, you can beat the tar out of these people, regardless of your size. If you're like a 5'2" woman, you can still really hold your own, because hate and prejudice are not martial arts, and these people in the camp of the Antifa and on the camp of the white supremacists don't know how to fight. Okay. And because of the UFC, there used to be this kind of question mark of like, oh, well, we don't really know what martial arts the best. There was all these like arguments back in the day of like, oh no, well, it's Taekwondo, no, it's Subudo, no, it's something else. And what we found, because of the UFC, which was designed to be a contest between martial artists to see which one really was the greatest, striking and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu grappling are two things that anybody can do. If you can learn how to throw a punch, move your head, and move your body when somebody's trying to hit you, you can topple a much larger opponent, because most people don't have any like efficiency with the way they hit. They just swing their arms around like children dusting it up on the playground. And the second thing is, if you can take somebody down, you can YouTube videos of like, do BJJ versus NFL, and like 145-pound Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner who's really good can take an NFL lineman, 275 pounds, and kind of a simulated street fight, and tear this dude limb from limb over and over again. And so, this idea that like I put out there that like, hey, these people don't know what they're doing. If you want to feel safe, I carry a gun, but I can't carry a gun everywhere. I can only carry a gun where I can legally carry it, which doesn't include Illinois, which I'm in a lot. Nobody can take away my hands and feet and knowledge from me, right? So if I know how to use my body to defend myself, I'm in a much better position than always relying on, I'll be carrying a gun at the time. And I got some pushback from like somebody I used to work with as a Christian. It's like, oh no, well, Jesus showed us a better way. And I replied, if you believe that Jesus is calling you to take a beating at the hands of the KKK, to just get beat up, then I believe you should follow convictions. Absolutely, 100%. For most of us, that's not a reasonable argument. Okay. So what what I'm saying here is not that I'm trying to start fights or this is Punch a Nazi Day or something like that. What I'm saying is that we are in a period with increased acts of kind of large scale violence. Overall, America's gotten much safer from 1990 to now, much safer as far as violent crimes. However, these large scale violent events are popping out, and you don't know if there's going to be one in your town. You don't know if you're going to be leaving work, or all of a sudden there's going to be a mob, that's blocking traffic or something like that. Knowing how to use your body to defend yourself is a good thing. This idea that like, oh, well, if we would just be nonviolent, we could change history. One of the worst writers in Christian thought, because I'm a Christian, in my opinion, as far as world history, is Shane Claiborne, who's like this like kind of hippie guy out of Pennsylvania who like knits his own pants and cries and has a lot of feelings. Shane wrote about World War II that all the Christians should have marched out and said to Hitler, we won't let you do this, like an unarmed protest. If only there were a way to know what the Nazis did with unarmed protesters. Oh yeah, they did kill 11 million people. They did kill 6 million Jews. We could maybe even ask the Jews who survived, hey, so did that work out for you? I mean, it's just the most ridiculous argument that if you have any plan for self-defense, that you're somehow part of the problem. This is what violence is. Violence is aggression towards someone else carried out in a physical act. If you're defending yourself by the rule of law, in a court of law, you are not committing violence. You are trying to preserve the life and safety of yourself and the people around you. Okay, you can't just go attack people. But if someone genuinely attacks you and you have no other option, it's you can't win, lose, or flee. If you can't flee, if you can't retreat, and it's win or lose, you should win. And you should have every tool available that you're able to for you to be able to win. And if that includes, some grappling classes that are going to give you confidence and, show you how to armbar somebody to submit them so that they stop attacking you, I mean, I don't get the downside. Like, this is an overly emotional response from, quite frankly, white people who have lived in subdivisions, who have never faced any kind of physical adversity like that. Number 8, the KKK is back. This is a short one. KKK clans, or I guess I should say KK clans to be correct, have doubled in the last 3 years. This should concern absolutely everybody. Number 9, we're back to the segregation or unity question that we were talking about with Robert E. Lee and sending former slaves to Liberia to give them a new life. Again, this is tough. Like, do we integrate or do we live separately? Because, one of the responses of, the police shootings that have happened over the last few years and now events like this is that there's a portion of the Black community that's saying, we need to support Black-owned businesses and have our own communities, and basically build our own thing, right? And I don't think that's a completely unreasonable reaction to what's going on or to history. That historically, when Blacks have done well, that whites have tried to screw it up. Black Wall Street was a very real thing. This was a flourishing business district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that whites burned out just because Blacks were doing well. So is it that, or is it MLK, where we come together? And it's not that we have a colorblind society, but it's that we learn to appreciate each other's differences and live side by side. There's going to be arguments in favor of both of those things right now, although I would say that predominantly what I'm seeing coming from at least Black activists is more of a separatist mindset right now. And I mean, I'm not the person to judge that. This conversation has been going on in civil rights for a very long time, but how that is answered will affect the next 50 to 100 years of the United States. As far as us becoming like a more colorblind society, it seemed like, we were getting there before this big backlash. I would say that the longer this like KKK white supremacist stuff goes on, they may get some more followers, but the more people who are going to hate them, and want to drive them out. One of the things that's concerning, right, is these quote unquote activists online who are trying to identify people in photos of the marchers. And that's great, except for some of the time they're getting this wrong. And I mean, I am terrified that an innocent person is going to get murdered in cold blood and somebody's going to, lose their life to spending the rest of it in prison because they misidentified a quote unquote white supremacist and went and killed them. Because somebody did sloppy journalism on the internet. And I mean, if we're going to do this, like, I actually think this is a solution. I do think this is a solution, but we can't just within 48 hours be doing this. We need to have some kind of thorough journalism that's going on. Sort of like there's like a child molester, database for your neighborhood so you can see who's a sex offender. There should, if a very well-organized, well-funded group actually did thorough research and had evidence that people were stepping out into public as white supremacists and wanted to create a database for that. I do think that holding people accountable that way is a great way to change people's behavior, right? But I'm afraid somebody innocent is going to die because we have armchair quarterbacks on Twitter that are not journalists. They're not doing research. They're just kind of like trying to match up like Facebook profile photos. And people look pretty similar. There are 350 million people in the United States. The odds that there's 4 or 5 or 10 or 15 people who look a lot like you are pretty high. And there have already been a couple of individuals, and you can, Google this, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, Fox News are all reporting on it, to where somebody who's completely innocent has now lost their ability to feel safe because you have these counter protesters that are harassing them. And, going back to the Antifa, these Marxists who start violence at places like Berkeley. I mean, if they're willing to riot at Berkeley and burn stuff down and destroy things, then one of them might be willing to murder someone in their sleep. So this is not a solution. Finally, what about all the like blowback, all the side protests, all the other anger? I mean, this is where I'm trying to do something small in my own world with neighbors again, of creating this place that we come together. Sadly, the thing that maybe feels the most personal to me is that it's at the Cardinals games over the weekend. St. Louis Cardinals. You could argue that the Cardinals are almost a secondary religion where I grew up. Black fans were yelling at white fans, and there's this thing of like, oh, well, there aren't any, why are there not more black members of the team? And okay, first of all, there's not more black members of the St. Louis Cardinals because there's not more black people in baseball, men in baseball, because it's such a Hispanic game at this point. Like, because most of the players are Hispanic or come from Latin America, direct immigrants. It's sort of like saying, why are there why are there not more blacks in boxing at this point? And it's not that there aren't, right? It's not that there aren't some great black boxers. But boxing has become a very predominantly Hispanic endeavor at this point. And so if there's less people of a certain group going in, you're going to get less people at the pro level, right? And so what do we do with stuff like this where, there's clear blowback that's not reasonable, that doesn't have anything to do with the root the root issue here, which is the KKK in Virginia. I mean, what do you do as a white person who goes to a baseball game in St. Louis, and there's black people that are mad that there are not more black people on the team? Which, I mean, as a person, by default, if you're sitting in the stands, you're not the manager of the team. I don't know if you know that, but managers don't sit in the stands. General managers don't sit in the stands. Owners don't sit in the stands. I mean, as much as possible, and this is difficult, right? But maybe people that are that angry, a starting place is to try to maybe calm the situation down and lead with some empathy and actually try to talk to somebody like that. And again, this goes back to neighbors again, right? Like, not that you're necessarily going to change their mind, but maybe you can give them a positive interaction. Which, by the way, I don't think works as well with the KKK. I've got a guy coming on later this month who's an old friend of mine, Christian Picciolini, who started a group called Life After Hate. He ran a division of the white supremacist movement in the United States until he became okay. And he would say the same thing, that people leave the white supremacist movement. They mainly join because they're lonely, because they don't have friends, because they've been bullied, and this is a group that will accept them. And that empathy actually is the key to this whole thing, to getting people to leave this dangerous ideology, except for a few true believers that are just crazy, right? Somebody else is going to have to do that. That's not my job in life. I'm just not going to be and maybe I'm wrong there, right? Maybe I should be having a different mindset there. But as far as if this thing comes to my town, and I'm talking about my town, like maybe Kenosha, maybe Racine, I'm not out looking for trouble. But if this thing comes to my town, I'm going to join whatever the counter protest is. And there's a lot of people saying, well, they're just as bad because those are, the Antifa, and they commit violence at, at other places. I agree. And as soon as the Antifa comes into town as the primary protesters, then I'll stand against them. But I will remind you of the World War II lesson, that we had to work briefly with the communists to destroy the Nazis. And then we had to, work on destroying the communists. And I actually think that in pretty much every way, the Antifa is equal to the Nazi movements going on right now. It is the communists and Marxists, and both groups have killed millions upon millions upon millions of people. Like, it drives me crazy when people say, "Oh, well, there's never really been an attempt to to try socialism? Yes, there has. And every single time it has resulted in the death of hundreds of thousands or millions of the citizens. Shut up. You have a stupid ideology that can't be defended. All right. So and that's what I'm talking about. Like socialism, not in like the democratic socialist Sweden thing, but like socialism, like Marxism. Right. But if this comes to my town, I'm not out looking for a fight. I'm not out looking for trouble. But there has to be a line in the sand. And if this comes to my town, then I have to, in my belief system is I have to go stand out there across the way. All right. And I'm not looking for violence. I'm not looking for trouble. But if somebody comes at me, going back to the self-defense thing, odds are that I know how to throw a punch much better than they have because I've spent a pretty good amount of time in a boxing gym. So to sum this whole thing up, please try not to put statements on social media. If you are not this, then I don't want to be friends anymore. Then you're going to hell. Then God have mercy upon your soul. And that's, and it's mainly people who are on the Democratic side of things blaming Trump voters for this. All right. Trump voters did not want this. Most people who voted for Trump in the general election, myself included, I didn't know if I was going to do it until the morning of. Most people didn't want Trump. I mean, a vast minority of the United States voted for Trump or Hillary in the primaries. Based on the fact that there was a vacant Supreme Court seat and based on what I knew about the Clintons, I made a tough decision that I've questioned that day and every day since then. And to alienate those people of like, oh, well, you're a racist and you're a terrible person. What do you expect to get out of that exactly? Like, all you're really doing is just demonizing somebody for the sake of demonizing them. And that does not bring us any closer to a solution. All right. And so I would say that, particularly people who are on the other side of the aisle, keep in mind, there are only two teams here. All right. There are only two sides of this issue. There's racists and non-racists. All right. There's people who believe a fascist agenda, which would include absolutely the Antifa and the white supremacists. And there are the rest of us. And if you're going to be the person to split the rest of us into a bunch of factions, and that's how the majority loses something, it's just not helpful. Thanks for listening to this. If you got all the way through it, this took a lot of energy out of me, over the course of an hour. It's 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning when I'm recording this. It's tough. Just this whole thing is very tough. I feel it a lot. I never thought that I would live in a world where both of the enemies, that the greatest generation, that my grandfather and great uncles answered the draft call to go fight, would be on our shores. It would be so active. And God forbid that I might even have to choose standing with one of those on a picket line. This is a very tough time in American history. And we need people of courage, but we also need people of common sense. And we need people of empathy. So that's where I come down. As much as I can, I will have a discussion with anybody on a one-on-one basis to try to get them to see reason. And until the moment where they try to hurt myself or somebody else, I'll try to keep having that conversation. And the moment you try to hurt somebody because of their race or their viewpoint or whatever, God help you, because the communists and the Nazis tried pretty hard to kill several members of my family, and they're batting zero. So I don't think you're going to get a kill this time around either. I just don't. Yeah, this has been episode 32. This is really, really tough. If you are a person of any kind of faith, I would ask that you would pray and realize that Yeah, now is the time for common sense. And thanks for coming back here.